Hello and welcome to a new podcast series from Lead the Future, Create the Future, Change the Conversation. Still have to get used to the new name. Just already made a mistake. Well, this is a raw podcast with raw footage. We're not going to edit it. But I'm really happy to have another conversation with my personal friend and peer, Benj Street, about leadership and futurizing and actually leading yourself to the future. So welcome, Benj. Thank you for your time. Let's talk about self-leadership. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about lead the future.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. So what do you think about? What do you think about with self-leadership and the future?
Well, I'll be honest, if you'd asked me this question 4 years ago, I would have run the other way, I think, because I didn't even know what leadership in the present meant, let alone being able to grasp the concept of sort of leadership in the future. And I certainly didn't know the difference between leadership and self-leadership. So for me, it's been the last 3 or 4 years, certainly, and maybe longer, if I'm honest, but consciously for the last 4 years have been about learning about all of these concepts and applying them. So I think, for me, there was a trigger that made me start thinking about it, and I think that's one of the interesting things that I'm interested in talking about today. Is how do you go from being blissfully unaware to actually proactively looking to change the conversation and lead the future, lead the future me, lead my future family, lead my future business, lead the society of the future that I want to see.
Yeah, that's an interesting actually reflection early in our podcast, is that self-leadership is the essential first step, but being able to lead yourself is the end of that first step. It started with a trigger. It started with something else than the awareness. Oh, I need to prioritize my personal development. You said 4 years, even longer. I think for me, it's similar timeline that I became aware that self-leadership is the first stage. After working years in corporate life, where you have so many trainings and certificates of attendance.
Yeah.
But self-leadership is the essential first step. So what triggered you? Can you recall that trigger?
I think there were many, but I wasn't aware of them all at the time, if that makes sense. So with hindsight, you can see a lot more triggers that didn't get me that should have got me. But for me, I think one of the deciding triggers, if we call it that, was a not healthy parenting moment where I lost my cool with my teenage daughter. And I ranted and raved and realized at the end of it, I think I shocked myself into, who am I? I don't want to be like this. I don't want to have this kind of relationship with the people closest to me. There must be a different way. I need help, actually, as well, was part of that process, probably. How do I do something about it? But I think, you know, some of the other triggers that I know now in hindsight were there, and I hear them in other people around me from time to time, is I'm just doing this because I have to. What I'm doing isn't purposeful. I feel like I'm dying inside when I'm doing this kind of thing. So I think, you know, often it's the negative in hindsight, you know, that negative perception, that dissatisfaction with this, with where we are and the status quo, that started me on a journey of exploration to go, there's got to be something better than this. It can't be what it's meant, you know, this is not how it's meant to be.
Yeah. Well, the painful moments, I think we all have those painful moments where we initially are ashamed of our behavior, but with hindsight, grateful that we embraced that moment and recognized the trigger and started working on it or at it. And in that perspective, the vulnerability to yourself, to not cover it up and swallow actually your pride and say, no, I have to work on it. And sometimes there's those triggers, but I think for people, entrepreneurs, leaders, people who run a household, it is also that awareness that you can be lonely. And loneliness, we see it around it quite a lot. We hear it quite a lot, that people lonely at the top have weird behavior and miss the trigger. So for me, I think it was, besides, I could tell stories about where I lost it as well, but it is actually also recognizing that I lack something which I don't want. One of those things I experienced as being lonely. Now, especially when we talk about the future is something we have not seen with our physical eyes, so we cannot recall it from memory. Actually, we don't have language. We want to talk about it. There is this urge to find words to what we sense, what we want. Emotionally, that feels like there's something missing. I'm hungry for more, but I'm not sure what I'm hungry for. You know, those kind of things I remember as well as the triggers that, like, I love it what you said. With hindsight, I recognize. And that I think that is a very important thing, that hindsight of wisdom that you gain by looking back. Probably an important step from self-leadership too.
Yeah.
So how did you navigate that from the trigger?
I think you described some of it, which is the not giving in to the shame feelings and making a conscious decision to do something about it, to you know, the short term clean up my mess, restore and work on the relationship in the immediate term. But I started reading about how you can change. I started talking to people. I joined, and this is a shameless plug, but I joined a mastermind of other people who also wanted to grow and change, not necessarily for the same reasons or in exactly the same way, but who wanted to discover who they could become. And yeah, found ways to talk about it to people, and that definitely helps, as hard as it is. But like leaning massively into that vulnerability, not hide behind, I think when you're in leadership position, or you're trying to lead, there's always a temptation to put on a front, to be what you think other people expect you to be, and to hide, the shadowy spots in character and in behavior, and the weak, hide your weaknesses. And I'm not saying at the same time, that the converse is true, that we should just sit there and splurge all our weakness in front of everybody. But to find peers, people who actually can see, and you're allowed to see those inner bits and go, I'm working on this is where I'm going. Does that sound right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
What's your experience?
yeah, well, it definitely does. In this whole journey of, and I call it finding language for what I sense on the inside, what is hidden on the inside. One of the lessons I learned is you cannot just share those things with everyone. And that has nothing to do with level of trust or loyalty. It all has to do with where the other person is at in their journey. So I've experienced that very close relationships got under so much tension by me trying to express what I sense on the inside, and of course failing miserably 100 times, because the words that came out were just not yet right to express what I sense. And so many people around me, really dear friends, got confused, offended, and actually it's very old wisdom, somewhere probably from the 40s, that find a mastermind, find peers where you talk about those things, that are on the same journey, in that way, sense, share purpose around finding that, because they know that the process is vulnerable, messy, and because peers in those settings should not have a stake in your development or your progress, so they should not be offended or confused, because they're not tossed around by your crazy ideas that you change every week. And although this sounds maybe like a really messy process, it is that process called learning that I love to have people around me that support me, encourage me, celebrate me, try to understand me. And that's what pops up in my mind that ended that loneliness. That loneliness,
Yeah.
As a leader, of that I could speak about what I didn't understand myself. Just test new language. We all know the example of the light bulb. The light bulb was not invented. There were a few hundred ways invented that didn't work. And I think that process is finding out who you can become, finding out what your authority is, finding out who you are in your fullness and what you can contribute.
Yeah. I think the other thing that pops into my head is, whilst everything I've kind of spoken about has been about dealing with flaws that I saw, I think stepping into the journey and the encouragement of the others on the same journey has been that actually you don't need to focus on those. Almost you can focus on a journey of exploration of what is the hidden gems inside me that need to be the things that I focus on and come out. And as a result of that, you also work on the flaws, but you can focus on that hope-filled view and perspective of what the future could become, and that gives you energy to keep going. Yeah,
with the end in mind,
yeah,
instead of, well, I remember what I learned as a business and strategy architect back in the day. It was always you had the choice what to work on, get clarity about first. The as is, the to be, or over here they called it the east and the soul. But which future in mind, which is same as strategy in mind. You want to know, you want to have that filter through where you want to go, so that all the adjusting, all the self-steering that's part of this journey is focused on having that endpoint, in mind. And there's so many things that are actually not part of the future in their current form and shape. And they disappear to the sideline. And some, if they're a character, or call it flaw or invitation, then they pop up, with this eruption of rage that once in a decade happens and surprises you. Then it is isn't that the golden opportunity? Like, oh, don't shuffle it under the carpet. This is the trigger to start working on it, so that it's really, that we can really leave it behind.
yeah.
So to wrap up, because we can talk for hours, and we want to keep it, well, bite size. It's not, but at least short. You mentioned mastermind. Well, that's where you got to know each other as peers in this journey. Which brings me back, that is just a tool to prioritize personal development. And if I would make one point in this podcast, then I would say that healthy leadership is about self-leadership from the inside out, and it starts with prioritizing learning. So I can just invite the listeners to try such a group and find your peers, find your mastermind. What's your thought about that?
I'd love it. So every time a new person joins the mastermind, selfishly, it's a huge acceleration and encouragement, because you learn a little bit more that you're not alone, even when you have felt lonely, and that your journey and that journey of discovery is actually shared with lots of other people who are choosing to invest in themselves. So yeah, if anybody's listening to this, we would love to have you on a mastermind. The only warning is it will change your life if you put in and show up. You might just discover who you could become and be part of this crazy adventure to change the conversation, change the world around us.
Yeah.
The world's changing. Do you want to be part of the conversation to change it, or do you want to allow it to happen to you? That's the only choice, really.
Absolutely. Find your voice and take part of changing the conversation. that's how the future is created. It's spoken into existence. It starts with ourselves. And if we start speaking about it, we start believing about it, we start behaving that way, and we start creating it. So I second that. So Benj, thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to chat a lot more about leading the future. So take care, my friend, and
Thank you very much.
speak to you later.
Bye.